It started like any other quiet morning at the lake. I stepped out onto my porch with a cup of coffee, ready to enjoy the view like I always did. The water was calm. Sunlight danced on the surface, but something felt off. I glanced to the right, where my dock should have been. At first, I thought maybe the fog was playing tricks on me. But as I walked closer, my stomach dropped. There was no dock, only splintered wood floating in the shallows. Chunks of board scattered like driftwood. Nails, busted beams, even the old rope I used to tie up my canoe. It was all there, just wreckage, like something exploded. And it had. The dock I built with my own 2 hands, the one my kids fished from every summer, was gone. No warning, no message, just blown to bits. I stood there for a long moment, not even angry at first, just confused. It didn't make sense. Who would do something like this? Why? I checked my phone. Nothing. No alert. No text. Then I opened my mailbox and saw it. An envelope with the HOA stamp on it, dropped in like any other flyer. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Cold. Formal. This structure has been removed under emergency enforcement authority granted to the HOA board under subsection 4B regarding unauthorized modifications to community shoreline. No explanation. No pictures. No due process. Just a notice saying they had acted for the safety of all residents. That was their excuse. No phone call. No meeting. No face-to-face conversation. They didn't even have the decency to knock on my door. They just came in, destroyed my property, and left me a note. I didn't even know they had the power to do something like this. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But that wouldn't stop Karen and her little board of clipboard warriors from pretending they could. I walked ashore, picking up pieces of what was left. My canoe was lodged halfway under a busted beam. A cooler that used to sit on the dock had been tossed into the bushes like trash. The floating solar light I'd installed, smashed and sunk. That dock wasn't just a structure. It was a memory, a space that belonged to me, a part of the land I paid taxes on, maintained, and had permits for, and they'd taken away without a second thought. That was the moment I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not sadness, just resolve. I wasn't going to scream at them. I wasn't going to send angry emails or beg for an explanation. They wanted to play dirty. Fine. But they had no idea what I was capable of. I didn't build my home on this lake by accident. I knew what I owned. I knew the water lines, the property markers, the documents most people forget about after closing day. And I knew something they didn't. The lake they loved, the lake they hosted community kayaking events on, the one they wrote about in every HOA newsletter like it was their prized jewel. It wasn't theirs, at least not all of it. Because tucked into the fine print of an old land agreement, filed long before the HOA even existed, was a clause that gave me something very specific. Water rights. Not just shoreline access. Not just recreational use. Control. Ownership. Authority. Asterisk, asterisk. They blew up the wrong dock. So while they sat back, probably patting themselves on the back for protecting the community, I started digging. Not with a shovel, with documents, land surveys, county files, easement maps. And the more I read, the clearer it got. They weren't just in the wrong. They were standing on borrowed water. They built walking paths, shared launch points, even picnic spots that stretched into areas they technically didn't own. Areas I had rights to. Rights they'd never bothered to check, because they assumed no one would challenge them. But I wasn't just anyone. They wanted a fight. They just didn't know they'd picked it with a guy who could take their lake away 1 gallon at a time. I didn't tell anyone what I found right away. Not the neighbors. Not the HOA. I just kept quiet and started stacking evidence like bricks. Every document, every map, every letter from the county. If it had my name, the lake, or a boundary line on it, I printed it and kept it in a folder. That folder grew thick fast. It turns out the lake was built decades ago by a private developer. Back then, there was no HOA, just landowners and agreements. The developer carved out parcels, sold off lakeside lots, and granted specific water rights to some of the original buyers. My property? It came with more than just lake access. It came with something called riparian control over a section of the water, meaning I had the legal right to use, restrict, or modify the water in that portion. And the dock they destroyed? It sat exactly within that boundary. I reached out to a friend of mine who works in environmental permitting. He took one look at the documents and said, "They don't just owe you an apology, they owe you a dock." But I wasn't interested in apologies. I was interested in leverage. The HOA had been treating me like I was some out-of-line homeowner pushing boundaries. Meanwhile, they'd been staging kayak events, swimming lessons, and holiday barbecues on water they didn't even control. Their share dock? On my rights. Their so-called community swim zone. Half of it overlapped with my boundary line. I hadn't cared before. I'd let it go. I liked the peace and didn't want to stir trouble. But now they'd made it personal. So I started looking into what I could legally do. I wasn't about to poison a lake or go full villain. That's not my style. But what I found gave me all the tools I needed. The permits were still valid. The original land use agreements still stood, which meant I could, without violating any law, divert, drain, or restrict usage of the lake water on my section, if it was for personal maintenance, erosion control, or land protection. So I got to work. I brought in a contractor, told him I needed to reinforce my shoreline. He said we'd need to temporarily lower the water level to install proper barriers. I nodded and said, "Perfect." We filed a notice with the county, followed every step by the book, everything transparent, everything legal. The HOA didn't even notice until the water started dropping. At first, it was subtle, a few inches over a few days. Nothing dramatic. But by the end of the second week, you could see muddy patches near the shore. The shared dock no longer floated. It just sat crooked in the mud. Boats moored nearby tilted sideways. Fish moved further out. The picture-perfect lakefront started to look more like a sad, drying pond. That's when the email started. At first, they were friendly. "Hey, just wondering if you've noticed the water levels?" Then came the concerned messages. "We're checking with the city about potential leaks." By week 3, the panic had set in. Karen herself sent me a message. "We're investigating a drop in lake levels that seems to be affecting all shared properties. If you have any information or observations, please respond immediately." I didn't. I let her stew. I'd done everything by the book, filed the permits, followed the timeline, consulted the right agencies. The HOA had zero grounds to accuse me of wrongdoing because I hadn't done anything wrong. Not like them. They blew up my dock without a hearing, without approval, without even asking. They acted on a rule that didn't apply. I was acting on a right that absolutely did. And as the lake dropped lower and lower, the HOA began to realize what they'd stepped in. Their members were frustrated. People were complaining. One guy tried to move his pontoon, only to get it stuck in the shallow mud. Another neighbor sent an angry message to the board. Asterisk, why wasn't this lake issue brought up in the last meeting? Asterisk, the board didn't have answers. Karen didn't either. But I did. I just wasn't ready to share them yet. By the start of the 4th week, the lake had lost nearly 2 feet of water. The sandy banks were exposed in spots that hadn't seen daylight in years. You could follow the edge and see the old roots of trees, the bottom of docks that once floated proudly now leaning sideways in silence. It was like watching a slow unraveling, 1 inch at a time. I kept my routine the same. I mowed my lawn. I grilled out on the weekends. I waved politely at neighbors when they passed, even as they threw awkward glances toward my shrinking shoreline. They didn't know what to say. Some thought I was just ignoring the problem. Others suspected more, but none of them had the full picture. Meanwhile, the HOA was in chaos. I heard from a friend on the inside, someone who used to keep their head down at meetings but finally had enough of the drama. Apparently, emergency sessions were happening every few days now. Karen was furious, blaming the city, claiming there was a broken pipe underground, or that climate change had somehow decided to target our zip code. They even tried to bring in a lake restoration consultant, who walked the area for 10 minutes before saying, "This looks like a controlled drainage, not a natural shift." Karen didn't like that answer. Still, She pushed forward with her favorite tool, authority. She sent out an official HOA notice declaring that unauthorized landscape or shoreline modifications would not be tolerated, and that any resident contributing to the water drop would face penalties. I read that one twice, smiled, and filed in the trash, because by now I had more than just permits. I had photos. I had dated documents, certified surveys, and approval stamps from the county office. If they wanted to accuse me of something, they'd have to do it in front of a judge, and I'd be more than happy to bring my folder. But I didn't want to go to court. That wasn't the point. The point was to remind them they didn't own me, they didn't own the lake, and they certainly didn't have the right to destroy someone's private dock just because they didn't like how it looked or who used it. So I let the water keep dropping. Not dangerously, not recklessly, just enough to make them feel the way I did that morning I found my dock in pieces. Helpless. One day, I saw her carrying herself down near the shared dock, standing in ankle-deep muck with a measuring stick, scribbling notes like she could somehow reverse the truth by writing it down enough times. She spotted me watching from my porch and yelled something across the waterless gap between us. I couldn't hear all of it, but I caught enough. You're affecting the whole community. She didn't ask. She didn't apologize. She demanded. I just waved back and walked inside. Later that week, I got a certified letter on my doorstep. This time, it was from the HOA's attorney, claiming they wanted to open a dialogue regarding recent shoreline activity. No threats, just polite concern wrapped in legal jargon. A lot more respectful than their last communication. I let it sit for a couple of days. Then, I replied with my own letter. Short, direct. I attached copies of the original deed, the permit filings, and a section from the Environmental Code that confirmed my right to make temporary shoreline changes for land maintenance. I ended it with one sentence. Since the HOA took action against my dock without warning or discussion, I chose to manage my property without warning or discussion. That's when things really shifted. Suddenly, neighbors who had kept quiet began stopping by again. Some just nodded. One dropped off a six-pack with a note that read, asterisk, should have never let them touch your dock. Asterisk another neighbor, whose pontoon had been stuck for days, actually apologized. I didn't know they did it without telling you, he said. That's just wrong. It wasn't about the dock anymore. It was about the line they crossed and how I responded, not with rage, but with control. By the end of that week, half the HOA board wanted to call a meeting with me, not to argue, not to fight, but to talk, because while the lake kept shrinking, so did their power. I showed up to that meeting late on purpose, not to be rude, just to let them sweat a little. When I walked into the clubhouse, I saw the usual suspects sitting at the long folding table. Karen at the center, arms crossed and lips pressed tight. Two other board members beside her pretending to look busy with papers. A few residents filled the chairs in the back, mostly silent. You could feel the tension, like everyone was holding their breath. They didn't offer me a seat at the table. I didn't ask for one either. Karen cleared her throat. We'd like to resolve this in a neighborly way, she said. Her tone was calm, almost forced. Definitely not the same woman who once yelled across the street about my fishing guests being non-residents. I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift in her seat. Finally, she continued, it's become clear that your recent property activities have impacted the entire community's access to the lake. While we understand you filed permits, we'd appreciate it if we could find a compromise for the sake of the neighborhood. I looked around the room. People weren't nodding. If anything, they were waiting to see what I'd say. So I stepped forward, slow and steady, and pulled a thick envelope from my coat. Inside, full-color photos of my dock before it was destroyed, permits, survey maps, and a timeline. Every document they'd ignored. I laid it gently on the table in front of her. I asked for compromise months ago. I said, before you sent a demolition crew to my dock without a hearing, before I got a notice taped to my mailbox, before the cops were called. One of the other board members, a younger guy with a nervous smile, tried to interject. We thought it was an unsafe structure. No, I cut in, calm but firm. You pretended it was unsafe because you didn't like it. Because I didn't go along with your paint-by-numbers HOA aesthetic. But that dock was permitted, inspected, and maintained. You didn't remove it. You destroyed it. Karen leaned forward, clearly trying to stay composed. We may have acted too quickly, but the situation with the lake is out of control now. We're just asking if you consider refilling it. I tilted my head. Just like that? No apology? No compensation? No rebuilding the dock you leveled? Silence. Someone in the back coughed. Another resident mumbled. He's got a point. Karen's voice dropped. What exactly do you want? Finally, the question I've been waiting for. I walked up to the table, placed both hands on the edge, and looked her dead in the eye. I want my dock rebuilt. Same size, same location, paid for by the HOA's maintenance fund. I want written confirmation that no further enforcement action will be taken against my property without a legal process. And I want an official apology, not just to me, but to the community, for mishandling the whole thing. Her jaw clenched. That's excessive. I shrugged. Then the lake stays empty. More silence. A woman in the audience spoke up. Karen, if this keeps going, we're going to lose property value. You already have 3 families who can't launch their boats. Another man added, why are we still pretending this isn't your fault? He didn't start this. You did. Now the tide was shifting. Karen could feel it. She wasn't used to people pushing back, especially not in public. I could see it in her eyes, the slow realization that the power she once held was slipping through her fingers like the very water she now wanted back. I didn't need to say more. I turned and walked out without waiting for a vote. Let them talk. Let them argue. They wanted me at the table. That was the price. A dock, an apology, and a promise. Until then, the lake stayed right where I left it, draining slowly, legally, and completely under my control. A week passed, then 2. Still no word. I figured they'd try to wait me out. Maybe they thought I'd cave, or maybe Karen was too stubborn to admit she'd pushed things too far. Either way, I didn't mind the silence. The longer they stalled, the more the lake receded, and the more the community noticed. People started acting differently. At first, they avoided eye contact when they passed my property. Now they stopped to talk. One guy, Mitch, lived 2 houses down. He was always polite, but kept to himself. He showed up one morning holding a mug of coffee and just said, "You were right." I asked him what he meant. That dock of yours should have never been touched. This whole thing's a mess, and we all know it. Turns out Mitch's son couldn't take the boat out for his weekend fishing trip. Water was too low. Another neighbor, an older woman named Denise, had planted a garden that now sat dry and cracked because the lake used to regulate the moisture in the nearby soil. People were feeling it, even the ones who'd stayed neutral when this whole thing started. And slowly the support shifted, not just in whispers, but in action. Denise sent a formal letter to the board asking them to resolve the situation. Mitch posted photos of his stranded canoe on the HOA's community app with the caption, *, was this worth it? *. Karen tried to spin it. She sent out an email saying the unexpected drought conditions were being looked into. I laughed when I read that. Drought? We had 3 solid rainstorms in 2 weeks. That lake should have been refilling, not disappearing. Still, I stayed quiet. That part was key. No bragging, no taunting, just letting the consequences speak louder than any argument ever could. Then one day, an SUV rolled into my driveway. Out stepped a man in a press shirt and a clipboard, not HOA, but a contractor. He introduced himself as someone sent by the board to take preliminary measurements for potential dock reconstruction. No note, no call, no apology. I asked him, "So, is this a peace offering or a legal cover-up?" He just shrugged and said, "I'm just here to measure, sir." I let him, watched him do the whole thing, without saying another word. Then when he packed up, he handed me a printed estimate with the HOA letterhead on top. It wasn't fancy, just a note saying they were considering rebuilding the dock under community improvement terms and needed my written consent to proceed. I read it 3 times. Still no apology, but it was something, a crack in the wall. So I made my own copy of the estimate, added a sticky note, and wrote 5 words in big, black letters. Add written apology, then talk. I mailed it right back. A few days later, I got a knock on the door. It wasn't Karen. It was a younger board member, the nervous one who tried to speak up during the last meeting. He looked tired, like someone who'd been stuck in the middle of a fire he didn't start. He handed me a sealed envelope and said, "They voted. It passed." Inside was a short letter signed by all board members, including Karen. It stated that the HOA would fund the full dock rebuild, that they acknowledged acted without proper process, and that they formally apologized for the incident and its consequences. I read it once. Then again. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The next morning, I called the contractor myself, told him he could begin. Within days, the noise of hammers and saws echoed across the waterless shore. A new dock took shape where the old one had been destroyed. Not identical, better, stronger, built to last. Neighbors walked by and gave thumbs-ups. One even brought over iced tea and sat with me while the crew worked. It felt different now. Not like I was fighting against the community, more like I was standing up for it. Meanwhile, the lake remained low, not out of spite, just business. I hadn't made the call to restore the water yet. First, I wanted to see if they'd finished what they started, properly, respectfully, because actions, not words, would decide when the lake came back. The rebuild took just over a week. The crew worked fast, probably paid extra to finish before more people started asking questions. They showed up early, left late, and didn't waste time. Each day, I stood on the edge of my property with coffee in hand, watching the new boards go down one by one. It was strange how something so simple, just a dock, had triggered all of this. But it wasn't about the wood or the nails. It was about respect. On the last day of construction, they bolted down the final plank and added new solar lights along the edges. A small touch, but a nice one. And unlike before, they didn't do it behind my back. They knocked on my door, handed me a signed completion form, and asked me to inspect it. I stepped onto the new dock, walked slowly to the end, and looked out across the shallow lake bed. Boats still sat stranded in thick mud. Ducks waddled where they used to swim. You could see the dry lines along the banks showing just how far the water had dropped. The dock was perfect, but I still wasn't ready to flip the switch. That afternoon, Karen herself sent a personal message. It was short, clipped, but civil. She asked if I'd consider coordinating the water restoration in the interest of the entire community's well-being. There was no tone, no bossy demands this time, just a request. And I could tell she didn't want to send it, but she had. A few hours later, I received another message. This one was different. It came from a resident named Arthur, someone I barely knew. Older guy, quiet, always kept his lawn neat. He wrote, "I've lived here for 22 years. I remember when you moved in. You've never caused trouble. Just wanted your space. What they did was wrong. Just wanted you to know that not all of us stood behind it. And thanks for handling it the way you did. No yelling, no drama, just smart." That one hit different. See, when you get into fights like this, you start thinking it's just you versus them. But sometimes people are just afraid to speak up. They don't want to be the next target. So they stay quiet and hope the storm passes. But storms don't pass when you ignore them. They grow. And this one had gotten too big to ignore. So I made a call. Not to the HOA. Not to Karen. I called the county office, the same one I'd worked with to legally manage the water rights. I told them the maintenance project was complete, and I was authorizing gradual restoration of water flow. Nothing rushed, just a controlled refill to bring the lake back to normal levels. The guy on the phone said, "You sure?" I said, "Yeah, let's get it done." By the end of the next day, you could already see the change. The mud began to soften. The shoreline started darkening as moisture returned. Small waves lapped at the banks again. Even the birds came back, circling and splashing like they'd never left. That night, I sat on the new dock with the lights glowing gently under the stars. I watched the water creep back inch by inch, like nature was slowly forgiving the mess we made. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced. The next morning, I noticed a small gathering by the shared dock on the other side of the lake. A few board members, some neighbors. They weren't holding signs or shouting, just talking, watching, maybe even learning something. I didn't join them, didn't need to. Later that afternoon, a new sign appeared near the clubhouse. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, just a printed notice. Effective immediately, all HOA board enforcement actions must go through a vote with full community notification and documented cause. Emergency powers may no longer be used without third-party review. I smiled when I read that. Sometimes, change doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with quiet shifts, printed pages, and the sound of water slowly returning to where it belongs. Still, I kept to myself, stayed off the app, ignored the emails, let the board talk to each other while the lake climbed back, one silent ripple at a time. By the third week, the lake had almost returned to its old self. Not quite full, but the mud was gone. The ducks were back in their usual spot near the reeds, and the neighbors had stopped whispering every time I walked by. Boats started floating again. Even the shared dock, which had looked like an abandoned deck in the desert, was now rising with each day's tide. It was like nothing had happened, except it had. Everyone knew it. The dock on my side stood stronger than ever, and people noticed. A few even walked by slowly just to look at it. One man, probably new to the neighborhood, paused to ask, "Did you build that yourself?" I smiled. Not this time. But I made sure it got built right. Word had spread, not just about the dock or the lake, but about what actually happened. The version the board tried to push in the beginning, about a non-compliant dock and emergency action, that narrative had unraveled. The truth had replaced it. And while Karen hadn't stepped down, she wasn't strutting around like she used to. I started getting nods from people I hadn't even met before. One lady waved from her garden across the street and called out, "Glad to see that lake looking right again." I nodded back and just kept mowing the lawn. No speeches, no victory laps, just steady peace. Then something unexpected happened. A letter came in the mail, not from the HOA, but from a lawyer. For a split second, my stomach twisted. I thought maybe Karen had gotten bitter again, found some angle to drag this out legally. But when I opened it, I saw it wasn't a threat. It was from a neighboring community. Apparently, they were going through something similar. Their HOA had started removing trees without permission, enforcing random fines, and threatening property adjustments without any hearings. The letter said, "We heard what happened in your neighborhood and how you handled it. Would you be willing to speak with some of our residents about protecting property rights?" I nearly laughed. Me? The guy who just wanted a dock and a quiet life? But it made me realize something. This wasn't just a win over Karen. This was a warning shot heard by anyone who thought they could bulldoze people without consequence. Word travels, especially when someone pushes back without yelling, without breaking the law, and without backing down. I didn't respond to the letter right away. I needed time to think. Meanwhile, life at the lake had returned to a new kind of normal. But there were signs of change if you looked close enough. The board posted updates now, actual updates, with notices ahead of time. They even installed a suggestion box outside the clubhouse. People laughed at it, sure, but at least it showed they were trying. One morning, Karen passed me on the walking trail. We hadn't spoken since the dock was finished. She slowed down just a little, like she wanted to say something, but thought better of it. Then, without looking at me, she said, "The new dock looks nice." I didn't stop walking, just said, "Thanks," and kept going. That was enough. Later that week, I sat out on the dock as the sun went down. The air was still, the surface of the water calm, except for the occasional ripple from a fish or a drifting leaf. This was why I built the dock in the first place. Not to start a fight, not to prove a point, just for peace. A place to sit, think, breathe. As I sat there, a few kids from the neighborhood wandered to the edge of the shared shoreline with their fishing poles. I recognized them from a few houses down. They didn't know or care about HOA politics. They just wanted to catch something and have a story to tell their parents. And I love that. One of them waved. "Hey, mister, catch anything today?" I smiled. Not yet. He grinned. Maybe tomorrow. And just like that, the moment settled. Not loud, not dramatic, just right. The lake was back. The dock stood firm. And even though things had changed, some parts were finally starting to feel like home again. A few days after that quiet evening on the dock, I got another knock on my door. This time, it wasn't the board or contractor. It was a couple I barely recognized, holding a folder and looking a little uncomfortable. They introduced themselves as Greg and Melissa, newer residents from the far end of the lake, on a part of the shoreline where the HOA had plans to build a community gazebo. Or at least they had plans. Until recently. Turns out, the board had already started pushing the idea forward without a proper vote. Greg said they got a letter telling them the gazebo construction would happen just a few feet from their backyard, without any discussion or input. He'd heard about what happened with my dock in the lake, and now he wanted to understand how I'd handled it. Not to fight, but to learn. We sat on the porch for an hour. I told him everything. The silence, the letters, the research, the permits, how I never raised my voice, but never backed off either. They listened carefully, asked smart questions, and when they left, they looked more confident than when they'd arrived. Later that week, I saw something new on the HOA message board. A petition started by Greg and Melissa calling for mandatory resident voting before any permanent structures could be built on shared spaces. In less than 48 hours, it had more signatures than the last 3 board elections combined. Karen didn't say a word about it, not in the emails, not in the meeting minutes. But everyone saw the shift. The board wasn't used to being questioned, but now the community wasn't just watching, they were involved. As for me, I kept to my routine. Morning coffee on the dock, evening walks along the trail. Every now and then, someone would stop and ask how the lake was holding up. I always gave the same answer. Better than ever. One afternoon, a small boy, probably around 8 or 9, wandered near the edge of my dock with a toy boat in hand. His mom was nearby, looking a little nervous. I waved him over and asked the kid if he wanted to try launching it. His eyes lit up. The boat floated perfectly, its little sails catching the breeze as it glided out into the middle of the lake. He ran along the shoreline to follow it, laughing the whole way. His mom thanked me quietly, like she wasn't sure how to explain what all had happened here, but she appreciated that the place felt safe again. And that was something I kept noticing. The word safe. People started saying it more often, not because anything had been dangerous before, but because they'd been living under decisions that didn't involve them. When power feels unchecked, it makes people uneasy, even if they can't explain why. But now, the lake wasn't just full of water again. It was full of trust. One night, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, I stood at the end of my dock and watched the colors ripple across the water. Orange, pink, deep blue. It reminded me of the first time I saw the property, back when the lake was calm and full, and I didn't even know the HOA existed. Back then, I thought I was buying a quiet life, a small slice of nature. But in a way, I ended up with something more. I didn't just protect my dock. I reminded people that standing your ground, even silently, can ripple farther than you think. The water lapped gently at the posts. Somewhere across the lake, a family laughed over a fire pit. Another boat drifted past, music faintly playing from a Bluetooth speaker. There were no signs, no fences, no shouting. Just a lake. Peaceful. Oh, and a dock that stood not just on wood and bolts, but on everything it had taken to bring it back. One morning, I noticed something new pinned to the HOA bulletin board beside the clubhouse, something I'd never seen in all the years I'd lived by the lake. A printed agenda for an open forum, open to all residents, with one item listed in bold at the top: Community Oversight Proposal. No jargon, no secret votes, just a public space for neighbors to actually speak and be heard. It didn't happen because the board suddenly turned over a new leaf. It happened because people got tired of being quiet. The lake draining had been more than an inconvenience. It had made them look up from their routines and ask who really made the decisions around here and whether those decisions actually reflected the community. The forum was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. By the time I arrived, the room was already packed. Folding chairs lined every wall, and people were even standing in the back. This wasn't just a few residents showing mild interest. This was a whole neighborhood, ready to be part of something for once. I stood off to the side, watching. I didn't plan to speak unless I had to. This wasn't my show anymore. Greg and Melissa were sitting near the front, hands folded neatly, a printed copy of their petition on the floor beside them. Mitch, the neighbor with the stucco, was seated a few rows back, arms crossed and wearing a look that said he wasn't here to play nice. Karen walked in last. She didn't look like her usual self, less confident, more cautious. She gave a nod to the room, but didn't say much at first. One of the other board members, the quieter guy who had once handed me that envelope, opened the meeting with a short sentence. "We're here to listen." And then the room came alive. Neighbors stood up one after another. Some spoke with frustration, others with calm resolve. One woman read a statement about the importance of transparency in spending. A man in his 60s asked why they hadn't had a community vote on any major projects in the past 5 years. Another woman talked about how her family had felt bullied into repainting their house because a board member didn't like the color. But it wasn't just complaints. There were solutions. Proposals for rotating board seats, mandatory vote records, limits on enforcement powers, and even formation of a resident advisory council, one that had no ties to the board and would exist solely to review any enforcement before action was taken. And then someone stood up and mentioned me. They said, if that dock hadn't been destroyed, none of us would be here right now asking for change. And if that man hadn't handled it the way he did, without threats, without making it ugly, we'd probably still be waiting for answers. The room went quiet for a second. Heads turned. I didn't say anything. I just gave a small nod and kept my arms crossed. Karen finally took the mic. "I know I haven't been perfect," she said. "And I know the situation has exposed flaws in how we've handled things." She paused, as if swallowing her pride was still hard. "But I also know that no HOA should be feared by the people it's supposed to serve. And from now on, this board will serve, asterisk not dictate starred." The crowd didn't clap, but there were a few nods. No shouting, no jeers, just quiet understanding. After the meeting, as people drifted outside into the late afternoon sun, a few neighbors came over to shake my hand. One even brought over a slice of pie from the potluck table and said, "For the guy who drained a lake to make a point." I laughed, but not loud. It wasn't about pride. It was about peace. And even as things settled back into normal, kids playing near the water, grills firing up again, paddleboards back in motion, I could tell the neighborhood wasn't the same. They weren't afraid anymore. They'd seen what one person could do with a little patience and a lot of nerve. They'd seen how standing firm without shouting could move the ground under people who thought they stood above it. And the lake, as calm as ever, reflected that change in every ripple.